February 28, 2026, 11:47 p.m. 3 Russian Su-34 fighter bombers, full bomb loads, headed straight for Ukrainian defensive lines near Huliaipole. 40 seconds later, none of them would ever fly again. This is the story of how 2 Ukrainian F-16 pilots, flying in total darkness at treetop level, executed the most devastating air-to-air engagement of the entire war. 3 Su-34s, 3 kills, 40 seconds from lock to impact, and a message sent to every Russian pilot who thought Ukrainian skies were still safe to fly in. I'm your host at Ukraine Signal, where we analyze the battles that change wars. And this battle didn't just change a single night. It changed Russian air doctrine for the rest of the spring. Let's break it down. To understand what happened at 11:47 p.m. on February 28th, you need to understand what the Russian Air Force had been doing for the previous 3 weeks. Since early February 2026, Russia had launched a renewed air campaign across the southern front. The target: Ukrainian fortification lines stretching from Orikhiv to Huliaipole in Zaporizhzhia Oblast. These positions had been reinforced through the winter. Concrete bunkers, interconnected trench networks, anti-tank obstacles layered 3 lines deep. The kind of defenses that Russian ground forces had been bleeding against since autumn. Moscow's answer was glide bombs. Specifically, the FAB-500, equipped with UMPK glide kits, a cheap bolt-on wing and guidance package that turned a dumb 500-kilogram bomb into a GPS-guided munition with a range of roughly 60 to 70 kilometers. The Su-34, Russia's primary strike fighter bomber, could carry up to 4 of these kits simultaneously. A single sortie could drop 2 tons of high explosives onto a trench line from a distance that kept the aircraft well outside the range of most Ukrainian air defenses. And that was the problem. Through February, Russian Su-34 crews had developed a rhythm. They would launch from Morozovsk Air Base in Rostov Oblast, fly south, then cut west across occupied territory at medium altitude, around 7,000 meters. Once they reached the release point, they would loft their FAB-500 glide bombs toward pre-programmed GPS coordinates and turn for home. The whole process took less than 3 minutes in the target zone. Ukrainian forces on the ground were taking hits. 1 battalion reported losing 2 fortified positions in a single week to glide bomb strikes. The bombs didn't need to be accurate to within a meter. A 500-kilogram warhead landing within 30 meters of a trench still buries everyone inside it. Which weapon was deadlier in February 2026? A. Russian glide bombs from Su-34s. B. Iranian Shahed drones. C. Russian artillery. Comment below. The answer might surprise you. The Ukrainian Air Force had a new tool to fight back: the F-16AM. By late February 2026, Ukraine's 40th Tactical Aviation Brigade had been operational on the type for several months. Training had been conducted in Denmark and the Netherlands through 2024 and into early 2025, and the first combat-ready pairs had been flying missions since mid-2025. But there was a critical limitation: survivability. Russia's S-400 surface-to-air missile systems, positioned in occupied Crimea and across the southern front, created overlapping threat zones that extended deep into Ukrainian-controlled airspace. An F-16 flying at medium or high altitude within 200 kilometers of these batteries was visible and vulnerable, so the Ukrainian pilots adapted. They flew low, extremely low, below 100 meters above ground level when terrain permitted. At those altitudes, the curvature of the Earth and terrain masking blocked S-400 radar coverage. The trade-off was fuel consumption. Flying at low altitude with afterburner available burns through JP-8 at a punishing rate. Mission time was limited. Every intercept had to be planned with surgical efficiency. The pilots of the 40th Tactical Aviation Brigade had practiced this in simulation, in training flights over western Ukraine, and in a handful of earlier combat sorties that had yielded mixed results. One engagement in January 2026 had seen a Ukrainian F-16 fire an AIM-120 at a Russian Su-35 near Melitopol, but lose lock when the Russian pilot dove below radar coverage and deployed chaff. The missile went stupid and impacted in an open field. Lessons were learned. The next time, the Ukrainians would need better geometry, better timing, and better targeting data. That brings us to February 28th. At 10:30 p.m., a NATO E-3A AWACS aircraft, an airborne warning and control system platform, was orbiting in a racetrack pattern over western Romania. roughly 400 kilometers from the front line. The E-3A's AN/APY-2 radar, mounted in the distinctive rotodome above the fuselage, was scanning deep into Ukrainian and occupied territory. This radar can detect aircraft at ranges exceeding 400 kilometers and track hundreds of contacts simultaneously. It was linked via secure data link to Ukrainian Air Defense Command nodes. At 10:38 p.m., the AWACS detected 3 contacts lifting off from Morozovsk Air Base. Radar returns and electronic intelligence cross-referencing identified them as Su-34 fullback fighter bombers. They climbed to 8,000 meters and turned southwest, following the standard ingress route toward the southern front. Ukrainian Air Force Command received the data within seconds. 3 Su-34s, heading 240 degrees, speed 850 kilometers per hour. Estimated time to weapons release zone over Huliaipole, approximately 72 minutes. The scramble order went out at 10:41 p.m. Stay with me, because what happens in the next 66 minutes ends with 3 fireballs over Zaporizhzhia Oblast and the worst single night for Russian tactical aviation since the fall of 2024. At a dispersed airfield in western Ukraine, the exact location remains classified, though open-source analysts have narrowed it to one of 3 possible airstrips in the Lviv or Ivano-Frankivsk region. 2 F-16AM Block 20 fighters were sitting on alert status, engines cold but crews in the cockpit shelters, flight gear on, mission data cartridges loaded. The pilots were known by their call signs, Karpatsky 1 and Karpatsky 2. Ukrainian operational security prevents the release of their real names. What is known is that both were experienced pilots who had completed the F-16 transition course in Europe. Karpatsky 1 was the flight lead, with seniority in the brigade. Karpatsky 2 was his wingman, a younger pilot on his second operational rotation. At 10:44 p.m., both aircraft began engine start. The F-16's single Pratt & Whitney F-100PW 220 turbofan takes approximately 3 minutes to spool to idle and complete systems checks. By 10:48 p.m., both jets were taxiing toward the active runway. At 10:51 p.m., Karpatsky 1 released brakes and accelerated into the night sky. Karpatsky 2 followed 40 seconds later. They climbed to 300 meters, just enough to clear terrain and nearby obstacles, then pushed the nose down and dropped to low altitude. Their heading was east-southeast. Their route had been pre-planned to thread between known S-400 radar coverage arcs, using terrain features, river valleys, ridgelines, forested areas, as natural masking. They flew in tactical spread, roughly 2 kilometers apart laterally and 500 meters offset in altitude. Radio communications were minimal. Most coordination happened through the Link 16 data link system, which allowed both aircraft to share sensor data, targeting information, and pre-planned waypoints on their cockpit displays without transmitting voice calls that could be intercepted by Russian electronic warfare systems. At 11:15 p.m., the AWACS updated the Su-34 formation's position. The 3 Russian aircraft had descended to 7,000 meters and were now crossing into Zaporizhzhia Oblast airspace, approaching from the southeast. Their track was consistent with a glide bomb run against the Huliaipole defensive sector. Estimated time to weapons release, 32 minutes. The geometry was developing. The F-16s were approaching from the northwest. The Su-34s were coming from the southeast. The intercept point would be somewhere over the central Zaporizhzhia plains, flat agricultural land with almost no terrain masking for either side. The Ukrainian pilots had one critical advantage. The Su-34s didn't know they were coming. Russian airborne early warning coverage over the southern front was sporadic at best. Russia's A-50 AWACS fleet had been devastated. Ukraine had destroyed or damaged several of these irreplaceable aircraft through long-range strikes in 2024 and 2025. Without A-50 coverage, Russian pilots were relying on ground-based radar and their own aircraft's Leninets V-004 passive electronically scanned array radar for situational awareness. Against 2 F-16 flying at 60 meters above the ground and maintaining emission control, meaning their radars were off, the Su-34 crews were essentially blind to the approaching threat. At 11:31 p.m., the AWACS transmitted an updated targeting picture. The Su-34s were now 160 kilometers east of the F-16's position, maintaining course and speed. Formation tight, roughly 3 kilometers between each aircraft, flying in a shallow V. The lead aircraft and the left wingman were paired closely. The trailing aircraft was slightly offset to the right, and 500 meters higher. Karpatsky 1 began the timing calculation. At current closure rates, they would reach AIM-120C-7 AMRAAM maximum effective range in approximately 14 minutes. But maximum range was not the plan. The AIM-120C-7 has a published maximum range of around 120 kilometers when fired from high altitude at high speed against a non-maneuvering target. But range drops dramatically when the launching aircraft is low and slow. At the F-16's current altitude and speed, effective range would be more like 50 to 60 kilometers, and that assumed a cooperative target. The plan was to pop up. Rise from low altitude to engagement altitude, roughly 3,000 to 4,000 meters, activate the AN/APG-66V2 radar for a brief pulse Doppler search, acquire the targets, fire, and then descend back below the radar horizon before any S-400 battery could generate a firing solution. The entire pop-up and shoot sequence needed to happen in under 60 seconds. Any longer, and they risked detection. How many Su-34s did Ukraine destroy that night? A1, B2, C3. The answer is at the end of this video. At 11:39 p.m., the two F-16 crossed a pre-planned waypoint designated IP Alpha, the initial point for the intercept profile. This was the last navigation fix before the engagement. From here, the pilots transitioned from fuel-efficient cruise to combat configuration. Airspeed increased to 550 knots. Weapon systems were armed. Each F-16 carried 4 AIM-120C-7 AMRAAM missiles on underwing pylons, along with 2 AIM-9X Sidewinder heat seekers on the wingtips for close-range backup. The AIM-120C-7 is the backbone of NATO's Beyond Visual Range air combat capability. It weighs 152 kilograms, is 3.66 meters long, and carries a 23-kilogram blast fragmentation warhead with a proximity fuse. It uses inertial navigation for the mid-course phase, flying toward the predicted intercept point based on the target's last known position and velocity, and then activates its own onboard active radar seeker in the terminal phase to home in independently. This means the launching aircraft doesn't need to maintain radar contact after firing. Fire and forget. But fire and forget only works if the initial targeting data is accurate. And at the ranges they were planning to shoot, roughly 55 kilometers, the missiles would be in mid-course flight for nearly 40 seconds before going active. A lot can change in 40 seconds. The targets could maneuver. They could descend. They could activate jamming. This is where the AWACS made the difference. The E-3A over Romania was providing continuous track updates on the Su-34 formation via the Link 16 network. The targeting data appearing on the F-16 pilots' cockpit displays was not from their own radars. It was AWACS data, fused and transmitted in near real time. This meant the Ukrainian pilots could plan their shot geometry without ever radiating from their own aircraft. The Russians wouldn't get the first hint of danger until the F-16 radars flicked on for the final targeting solution. Subscribe to Ukraine Signal if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works, because engagements like this one are rewriting the rules of air combat in real time. 11:43 p.m. Range to the Su-34 formation, 80 kilometers in closing. The AWACS reported no change in Russian behavior. The three fullbacks were steady at 7,000 meters, speed 800 kilometers per hour, continuing their ingress toward the bomb release point. In approximately 4 minutes, they would reach the coordinates where their UMPK glide kits could acquire GPS lock on the Huliaipole targets. Once the bombs were released, the Su-34s would bank hard right and run for home. The intercept window was closing. Karpatsky 1 transmitted a single coded word over the encrypted tactical frequency, the brevity code for commencing the attack profile. Both F-16s pulled back on their sticks simultaneously. The sudden climb pushed both pilots into their seats as the aircraft traded speed for altitude. At low level, the terrain had been rushing past at nearly 300 meters per second. Now, the horizon dropped away as the fighters clawed upward through 1,000 meters. 2,000 meters, 3,000 meters. At 3,500 meters, Karpatsky 1's radar came alive. The AN/APG-66V2 is not the most advanced fighter radar in the world. It's a mechanically scanned pulse Doppler set, a generation behind the active electronically scanned arrays found on newer fighters. But it is reliable, proven, and well understood by its pilots. In the track-while-scan mode, it swept the forward hemisphere and immediately acquired 3 contacts at 57 kilometers. The radar returns matched the AWACS data perfectly. 3 targets, formation intact, no evasive maneuvers. Karpatsky 2's radar confirmed the picture a heartbeat later. 3 contacts, same bearing, same range, same altitude. The fire control computers on both aircraft began generating launch solutions. 11:44 p.m., the moment of decision. Karpatsky 1 designated the lead Su-34 and the left wingman as his targets. Karpatsky 2 took the trailing aircraft on the right. The task split had been briefed on the ground hours earlier. Karpatsky 1 squeezed the weapon release button on his side stick. The first AIM-120C-7 dropped from the left inboard pylon, its solid-fuel rocket motor igniting half a second later. The missile accelerated to Mach 4 within 3 seconds, trailing a thin plume of white exhaust against the black sky. 2 seconds later, he fired again. The second AMRAAM leapt off the right inboard pylon, its seeker head already programmed with the second target's predicted intercept coordinates. Karpatsky 2 fired 1 missile at the trailing Su-34, a single AIM-120C-7 streaking east at 4 times the speed of sound. 3 missiles in the air, 3 targets. Range at launch, 55 kilometers. Time to impact, approximately 40 seconds. The F-16's radars continued to paint the targets for 6 more seconds, feeding mid-course correction updates to the missiles via data link. Then both pilots pushed their noses down, descending rapidly back toward the deck. Radars went silent. The aircraft vanished below the radar horizon. The missiles were on their own now. At 35 kilometers from the targets, the first AIM-120's onboard active radar seeker activated. The missile's nose cone housed a small but powerful X-band radar that swept the volume of sky ahead. It found its target almost immediately. The lead Su-34, cruising fat and happy at 7,000 meters, loaded with 4 FAB-500 glide bombs, presented a radar cross-section the size of a small building. The missile's guidance computer made a final course correction and drove the weapon straight into the Su-34's fuselage, just aft of the cockpit. The 23-kilogram warhead detonated on contact, blast fragmentation, thousands of tungsten fragments ripping through the airframe at supersonic speed. The Su-34's fuel tanks, still heavy with JP-8, erupted. The aircraft broke apart in a catastrophic structural failure. The forward fuselage, including the cockpit section with its distinctive side-by-side seating, separated from the rest of the airframe and tumbled into darkness. No ejection was observed. The 2 crew members, pilot and weapon systems officer, had no time to react. From missile seeker activation to impact, less than 3 seconds. 4 seconds later, the second AIM-120 found the left wingman. This Su-34 had begun a slight turn to the left. Possibly the crew had received a radar warning alert in the final seconds and attempted to maneuver. It was too late. The AMRAAM's seeker tracked the turn effortlessly and impacted the left wing root, severing the wing entirely. The aircraft entered an uncontrollable roll. One ejection seat fired, a brief flash of light in the darkness as the rocket motor propelled a single crew member clear of the disintegrating aircraft. The other seat did not fire. Whether it malfunctioned or the crew member was already incapacitated by the blast is unknown. The third missile, Karpatsky 2's shot, hit the trailing Su-34 6 seconds after the second kill. This aircraft had been slightly higher and further back in the formation. Its crew may have seen the first 2 explosions ahead and below them. If they did, their reaction time was measured in fractions of seconds. The AIM-120 struck the Su-34 in the starboard engine nacelle, detonating the warhead inside the engine bay. The resulting explosion ruptured fuel lines and ignited the remaining bomb load. 4 FAB-500s, 2,000 kilograms of high explosive, cooked off in a chain detonation that turned the aircraft into a rolling fireball. Debris rained down over a 12-kilometer area near the occupied town of Tokmak. The engagement was over. From the moment Karpatsky 1's radar went active to the last impact. 40 seconds. 3 Su-34 fullback fighter bombers destroyed. If you believe tactics win wars, type Ukraine signal in the comments, because what you just heard is proof. The 2 F-16s descended back to low altitude and reversed course, heading west toward their recovery airfield. They had been above the radar horizon for less than 50 seconds total. No S-400 battery had achieved a lock. No Russian fighter had been vectored to intercept. The engagement had been a textbook pop-up attack, executed with precision that would be studied in NATO fighter weapons schools for years. Fuel state was critical. The low-altitude ingress and high-speed combat profile had burned through a significant portion of their internal fuel. Karpatsky 1 reported minimum fuel at the 150-kilometer mark from the recovery base. Both aircraft landed safely at approximately 12:20 a.m. on March 1st. On the ground, the aftermath was being documented in real time. Ukrainian reconnaissance drones, likely Fury or Shark-type UAVs, were already orbiting over the crash sites. Thermal imaging confirmed 3 separate impact zones spread across a 25-kilometer arc south of the Huliaipole sector. 2 crash sites showed concentrated debris fields consistent with mid-air breakup. The third, near Tokmak, was still burning fiercely, the FAB-500 warheads having detonated on impact and created a secondary explosion that left a crater visible on commercial satellite imagery the following day. The Ukrainian General Staff released a terse statement at 6 a.m. on March 1st. 3 Russian Su-34 aircraft destroyed during an air engagement over Zaporizhzhia Oblast. No Ukrainian losses. Moscow said nothing for 72 hours. This silence was telling. When Russia loses a single aircraft, the standard response is either denial or fabrication, claiming the aircraft returned safely or was lost to a technical malfunction. But losing 3 Su-34s in a single engagement was catastrophic enough that the usual propaganda mechanisms struggled to construct a narrative. The Su-34 is not a cheap aircraft. Each one costs an estimated $36 to $50 million depending on configuration and production year. 3 aircraft represented somewhere between $108 and $150 million in hardware, gone in 40 seconds. But the financial cost was secondary to the operational impact. Russia entered the full-scale invasion with approximately 130 Su-34s in its operational fleet. Attrition through 2022, 2023, 2024, and 2025 from Ukrainian air defenses, accidents, and now air-to-air combat had reduced that number significantly. Open-source trackers estimated Russia had fewer than 80 operational Su-34s remaining before this engagement. Losing 3 in one night represented nearly 4% of the remaining fleet. More critically, the Su-34 production line at the Novosibirsk aviation plant was producing replacement aircraft at a rate of roughly 8 to 12 per year. Russia was losing Su-34s faster than it could build them. Each loss tightened the noose around Russian tactical aviation's ability to sustain glide bomb operations across the entire front line. Within 72 hours of the shootdown, Russian aviation spotters, independent observers who track military aircraft movements at Russian air bases, reported that 3 specific tail numbers were missing from Morozovsk Air Base's flight line. The tail numbers corresponded to Su-34s assigned to the 559th Bomber Aviation Regiment, the unit responsible for strike operations over the southern front. Moscow could no longer deny the losses. Russian military bloggers reacted with fury. Some blamed the pilots for flying predictable routes. Others blamed ground controllers for failing to detect the F-16s. A few blamed the broader command structure for continuing glide bomb operations without adequate fighter escort or electronic warfare support. The truth was simpler and more damning. Russia had become complacent. For months, Su-34 crews had been flying their glide bomb missions with near impunity. Ukrainian ground-based air defenses could not reach them at 7,000 meters and 60 kilometers from the front line. The Russian crews had settled into patterns. Predictable routes, predictable altitudes, predictable timing. And patterns are what get you killed. What would NATO have done differently? Would a full squadron escort with electronic warfare support have saved those Su-34s? Comment your analysis below. 5 days after the engagement, on March 5th, Ukraine's Air Force Command released edited cockpit audio from the intercept. The recording, approximately 90 seconds long, captured the critical phase of the engagement. What struck military analysts worldwide was the tone. No shouting, no panic, no adrenaline-fueled combat calls. Karpatsky 1's voice was measured, almost clinical. Contact, 3 targets, bearing 095, range 57, Angels 70, a pause. Fox 3, Fox 3. The brevity code for an active radar-guided missile launch, repeated twice, 1 for each missile. Karpatsky 2, younger but equally controlled. Fox 3, single, confirming 1 missile away, then silence for several seconds. Karpatsky 1 again. Splash 1, a pause. Splash 2, confirming, kills on his targets. Karpatsky 2, Splash 3, target 3 down. Karpatsky 1, flight, come left 270, descend, let's go home. That was it. 67 seconds of audio that captured the destruction of 3 frontline fighter bombers and the deaths of up to 6 Russian aircrew, delivered with the emotional flatness of someone reading a weather report. Military psychologists noted that this calm was not an absence of emotion. It was the product of extensive training. The Danish and Dutch instructors who had prepared these pilots had drilled the intercept profile hundreds of times in simulators. When the real moment came, the Ukrainian pilots' nervous systems defaulted to the practice sequence: climb, radar on, acquire, fire, descend. The 40-second engagement happened almost exactly as it had in training. This is a critical point about the F-16 program in Ukraine. The aircraft themselves are not the latest variant. The F-16AM Block 20 is a midlife update of a design that first flew in the 1970s. Its radar, while functional, is a generation behind what American and European pilots fly with today. Its electronic warfare suite is limited compared to the Block 50/52 or the F-16V, but the aircraft was never the whole story. The story was always the pilots, the training, and the integration with NATO's intelligence and command infrastructure. Without the AWACS, Karpatsky 1 and Karpatsky 2 would have been flying blind. Without Link 16, they couldn't have received targeting data without radiating their own radars. Without the months of training in European fighter weapons schools, they wouldn't have had the muscle memory to execute a pop-up attack in total darkness at those speeds. The F-16 was the platform. NATO interoperability was the weapon. The immediate tactical impact was significant. In the week following the triple shootdown, Russian glide bomb sorties over the southern front dropped by an estimated 60%. Su-34 missions that did fly were accompanied by Su-35 fighter escorts and supported by ground-based electronic warfare systems broadcasting jamming across the frequency bands used by AIM-120 seekers. The comfortable, predictable bomb runs were over. This forced adaptation had consequences. Fighter escorts meant more fuel, more complexity, and fewer available sorties per day. Electronic warfare support meant fixed assets that Ukraine could target with its own long-range strike capabilities. The increased operational overhead effectively halved Russia's glide bomb output along the Zaporizhzhia sector for the remainder of March. For Ukrainian ground forces near Huliaipole, the relief was immediate. The defensive positions that had been under daily bombardment suddenly went quiet. Engineers used the respite to repair fortifications, reinforce bunker roofs, and lay additional minefields. Infantry units rotated fresh troops into positions that had been under constant pressure for weeks. The broader strategic implications rippled outward. Russian Air Force commanders were forced to confront a reality they had been avoiding. Ukrainian airspace was no longer a permissive environment for strike aviation. The F-16, even in limited numbers, had fundamentally altered the risk calculus. Every Su-34 sortie now carried the possibility of encountering an AMRAAM shot from a fighter that the crew couldn't see, couldn't detect, and couldn't outrun. This psychological impact should not be underestimated. Fighter pilots, regardless of nationality, operate on confidence. Confidence in their aircraft, their weapons, and their situational awareness. The February 28th engagement shattered that confidence for Russian Su-34 crews. Open-source intelligence analysts reported a measurable increase in Russian aircrew requesting transfers away from frontline strike units in the weeks following the shootdown. Morale, already fragile after years of attrition, took another hit. For Ukraine's 40th Tactical Aviation Brigade, the engagement was a validation of everything they had built. The transition from Soviet-era MiG-29s and Su-27s to the F-16 had been grueling. Language barriers, different cockpit philosophies, NATO procedures that were foreign to pilots raised on Soviet doctrine. All of it had to be overcome in compressed timelines under the pressure of an active war. And on the night of February 28th, 2 pilots from that program executed a perfect intercept under conditions that would have challenged any Air Force on Earth. The tactical lessons are clear, and they deserve examination. First, intelligence integration wins engagements. The AWACS provided a god's-eye view of the battle space that allowed the Ukrainian pilots to plan and execute their attack without ever revealing their position. In modern air warfare, the aircraft that sees first shoots first, and the one that shoots first almost always wins. NATO's intelligence infrastructure gave Ukraine that first look, first shot advantage. Second, predictability is lethality for the wrong side. The Russian Su-34 crews had been flying the same profiles, at the same altitudes, along the same routes for weeks. In any military context, pattern setting is an invitation to be ambushed. The Ukrainian Air Force studied those patterns, identified the vulnerability, and exploited it with devastating precision. Third, low-altitude tactics remain viable in the age of advanced air defenses. Despite Russia's extensive S-400 coverage, the F-16 successfully penetrated to engagement range by flying below the radar horizon. This required exceptional pilot skill. Low-altitude flight at night is among the most dangerous things a fighter pilot can do, but it proved that even dense air defense networks have gaps that can be exploited by aggressive, well-trained crews. Fourth, the AIM-120C-7 remains the benchmark in beyond visual range air combat. 3 missiles fired, 3 kills achieved, a 100% hit rate in combat conditions against targets that, while non-maneuvering, were equipped with radar warning receivers and chaff dispensers. The C-7 variant's improved seeker and extended range proved decisive. And fifth, small numbers can have outsized impact. Ukraine does not have hundreds of F-16s. It has a small fleet, carefully husbanded and employed. But 2 aircraft, armed with the right weapons, supported by the right intelligence, flown by the right pilots, destroyed 3 enemy aircraft worth over $100 million and disrupted an entire air campaign for weeks. Quality, applied with precision, defeated quantity. Now, for the answer to the question I posed earlier. How many Su-34s did Ukraine destroy that night? The answer is C, 3. All 3 aircraft from the formation were struck by AIM-120C-7 missiles and confirmed destroyed through a combination of reconnaissance drone footage, satellite imagery, and the eventual acknowledgement by Russian aviation spotters that 3 specific tail numbers never returned to Morozovsk Air Base. Before we close, 3 questions for you to consider. Was the decision to fly only 2 F-16 the right call? Or should Ukraine have committed a larger force to guarantee the intercept? A 3rd or 4th aircraft would have provided redundancy, but also increased the risk of detection and put more irreplaceable airframes in the S-400 threat envelope. What would you have decided? Could Russia have prevented this outcome? Fighter escorts, varying flight profiles, electronic warfare jamming on the ingress route, any of these measures might have complicated the intercept. Why didn't Russian commanders implement them before February 28th? And what does that tell us about Russian Air Force leadership at this stage of the war? And finally, what would you have done differently? If you were sitting in Karpatsky 1's cockpit that night, receiving AWACS data on 3 incoming Su-34s loaded with glide bombs headed for your fellow soldiers' positions, would you have taken the same shot at the same range? Or would you have closed further, accepting greater risk for greater certainty? Subscribe to Ukraine Signal, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. Real tactics, real consequences. Ukraine Signal. The skies over Huliaipole are quieter now. The glide bomb raids have slowed to a fraction of their February pace. Ukrainian troops in their reinforced positions stare up at the same sky those 3 fireballs lit up on the last night of February. And somewhere in western Ukraine, 2 pilots whose names the world may never know are reviewing mission tapes, refining tactics, and waiting for the next scramble order. The wrecks of 3 Su-34s lie scattered across the Zaporizhzhia countryside, charred metal half buried in the black earth. Silent reminders that modern warfare punishes tactical mistakes without mercy. Stay vigilant.